Good evening and welcome to Chicago Tonight. I'm Brandis Friedman. Paris Schutz is on assignment. On the show tonight, candidates for Illinois Attorney General Kwame Raoul and Tom DeVore face off.
Reported hate crimes are on the rise, particularly those based on race and religion.
Adidas ends its partnership with Ye, formerly known as Kanye West, following his anti-Semitic comments. This as a new report shows hate crimes are rising across Chicago. A look at how students with disabilities have been impacted by the pandemic in light of historic learning setbacks for students nationwide. And artistic views of elements of the Greek landscape. We talk with the photographer, a Greek prince, visiting Chicago. But first, some of today's top stories. Officials broke ground on a $380 million project known as the Forest Hill Flyover on Chicago's South Side. The project aims to speed up trains by untangling 2 passenger and 4 freight rail lines and, in turn, reduce traffic delays.
It's about the person or the family stuck in congestion, trying to make their way to work, to hospitals, to educational opportunities. It's about people sitting at grade crossings as the train goes by. It's about making sure that our transit system can move people reliably to where they need to go faster and affordably. It's about making sure that our goods make it to the places that they need to go so that businesses can operate.
It's one of 4 major projects included in the 75th Street Corridor Improvement Project. Construction is expected to take up to 2 years. After a year of negotiating for a new contract, teachers and faculty across the city colleges of Chicago are planning to go on strike next week if a new agreement isn't finalized. Teachers are pushing for smaller class sizes, greater access to remote learning and student support, increased wraparound services, and salary increases. The Cook County College Teachers Union, which represents 1,500 faculty and professionals within the city colleges, says its contract expired in July, but negotiations on a new deal began last October with no agreement in sight. Earlier this month, 92% of faculty and professionals voted to authorize a strike. As the Biden administration's student loan relief plan faces legal challenges, the Education Department says it's reducing red tape on an already existing loan forgiveness plan to make it easier for borrowers to qualify. Teachers, public defenders, and many other public sector workers pursuing public service loan forgiveness can now get credit for partial, late, or lump sum payments, or for payments made under a different repayment plan, as well as credit for periods in deferment and forbearance. The program has, for years, allowed those in public service to have their debt canceled after 10 years, but some have been unable to use the option due to complex requirements. The new regulations take effect on July 1st of next year. Coming up in the program, the rise in anti-Semitic hate crimes across the country. But first, Amanda Venicky kicks off our candidate forums this week with the race for Illinois Attorney General right after this.
Chicago Tonight is made possible in part by Alexandra and John Nichols, the Jim and Kay Mabey family, the Polk Brothers Foundation, and the support of these donors.
The seat of the state's chief legal officer is in the hands of Illinois voters. While a large part of the job involves consumer protections, the election comes at a time where pivotal legal issues are playing out within the state and nationwide. Politicians and legal officials are debating the state's SAFETY Act, which, among other changes to the criminal justice system, eliminates cash bail. And while Illinois is seen as an island for abortion access, the office could play a role in protecting traveling patients. Joining us in the order they appear on the ballot are Kwame Raoul, the incumbent and Democratic candidate for Attorney General, and Thomas DeVore, the Republican candidate for Attorney General. Also on the ballot is Libertarian candidate Daniel Robin. You can find out more about him on our WTTW online voter guide. One more note before we begin. This is not a formal debate. Candidates won't give opening or closing statements. Answers won't be timed. And I will use fairness as our guide. I asked the candidates not to filibuster or give campaign speeches. You can go to their websites, I'm sure, for those. So let's begin here with the matter of criminal justice, because that SAFETY Act is going into effect soon, January 1st. Attorney General Raoul, you said that there needs to be an ongoing conversation in regards to the threshold for determining which defendants are deemed a threat. What should that threshold be?
Well, making sure that we preserve, as common law preserves, a judge's discretion to use its inherent authority to protect the public from threat, to make sure that a defendant will likely return to court. And so,
is that specification needed? Does the judge have that under the Safety Act?
well, the judge has that, in fact, under common law, under an existing Supreme Court
So then
opinion.
are changes needed in the veto session?
I think changes are needed for clarification, because there may be some lack of interpretation and inconsistency. I said that, you indicated I said that conversations need to take place. Conversations are in fact taking place. We have state's attorneys at the table, we have sheriffs at the table speaking to the legislature right now, and that's the way it should happen. Amanda, you know, from year to year the legislature meets, and the vast majority of what the legislature does is amend existing statutes. The Safety Act is no different.
Mr. DeVore, would you like to pick up on that at all?
Yeah, I mean, the conversation should have taken place back in January of 2021. So the way that this bill was, the gut and replace of how it was passed created a lot of problems. And those problems we're talking about even today. So, the legislature talking to these state's attorneys, now almost 60 of them that have filed this case, I don't know what they're talking about, because at the end of the day, the law, the way it was passed procedurally, has constitutional problems. But the thing about the inherent authority that the Attorney General talks about, what it fails to address is that if you go to the actual statute, which is 725 ILCS 5/110-6.1, it talks about what types of cases the judge actually gets to address. And there's whole categories of cases that the judge's inherent authority never comes into play, because those accused of those particular crimes, they never go in front of the judge because the state's attorney never files the petition. So that's what has to be really addressed at some point.
A lot of people say that that isn't quite the case. The judge does have discretion. Mr. Raoul?
I agree with what you just said. The judge will have discretion, and when somebody's arrested, I know because I've prosecuted, they will come before the court.
And Mr. DeVore, go ahead.
Well, Mr. Raoul may have prosecuted, but I've defended. And don't take our word for it. Ask, again, the state's attorneys across this state. Because the judge's inherent authority, we would all acknowledge the judge has to see them first. And if the judge never sees someone accused of a crime because they're released, inherent authority doesn't matter. So again, if you go to the citations of the statute, it says only if you're accused of these particular categories of crimes will the state's attorney file a petition for a detention hearing. If it's outside those categories, the state's attorney never files the petition, so there's never a detention hearing, the judge never sees them, they're released pre-trial. That's just not my opinion. That's the opinion of overwhelming most of the state's attorneys.
Well, and a lot of discussion, of course, among state's attorneys, including, yes, that just about half of the states, or of Illinois state's attorneys, are suing to overturn this law. What do you make of that? This is something that is unprecedented as far as my knowledge.
It is, and it's referenced as nearly 60 lawsuits, but they're all the same. It's not as if these state's attorneys haven't spoken to each other. We speak to each other. My office actually sits on a weekly call of state's attorneys. And so the state's attorneys have concerns with regards to the Safety Act. And they're taking, I can't talk too much about the lawsuit because I'm defending them. But with regards to the legislative process, they're engaged there as well. You have State's Attorney Berlin, you have State's Attorney of Peoria County, of Champaign County. They're engaging the legislature as well as other stakeholders. And that's how it should happen. And that's how it has happened over years. The Safety Act, in fact, has already been amended.
Several times, in fact.
Yes.
So, Mr. DeVore, if you, go ahead.
But here's the issue. The Safety Act has been amended. That doesn't make it constitutional. Some of the main arguments that are being made by Mr. Glasgow and others who are in fact...
How is it unconstitutional?
The single issue rule. There's 8 different topics in this particular bill, and it's only supposed to be one. And there's others. But what's most important here is that, again, one of the things I think Mr. Rowell and I disagree on respectfully is that it should be the Attorney General making these arguments of constitutionality and other issues on this legislation, and not 60 of our county state's attorneys.
You would have, what, proactively gone to court to try to undermine this law or to reject it?
Well, when you say undermine, the Attorney General has an obligation to the people of this state that if the legislature passes a law that the Attorney General believes has constitutional problems and the governor signs it, the Attorney General has a duty to defend the people against that legislation. Now, if Mr. Raul thinks that it's constitutional, then he can defend the law. There's nothing wrong with that. But again, we have 60 now state's attorneys saying there's glaring constitutional issues, and I don't believe anyone has yet asked the Attorney General, do you believe it's constitutional or not?
Let's do it. Is it constitutional? Is the Safety Act constitutional?
I do believe it's constitutional, and I will defend it in court, as I'm charged to do so as by statute to represent. I'm not only representing the legislature, the governor, as I am. It's one of my inherent responsibilities as Attorney General, but they've also named me in the lawsuit. So
you are certainly a part of it. No, so Mr. DeVore, we are waiting to see the outcome, of course, of these now consolidated state's attorneys' cases. But if the law, Safety Act, does go into effect, will you now ensure that the act is followed?
If the act is actually found to be constitutional by the Illinois Supreme Court, then the Attorney General of this state has an obligation to enforce that law. Absolutely.
That could be quite a wait for the Illinois Supreme Court to come to a determination.
Certainly, could be.
So in the intervening period?
Well, in the intervening period, again, under the hypothetical that Mr. Raul is not successful in this, and I am, and then I would take over, my administration is actually going to be on the opposite side, and we're going to defend the people against the Safety Act, saying that it's unconstitutional, again, in its totality, which is not to say there aren't provisions of this law that may be good policy, but the law in its totality. I mean, it was shoved through the legislature at 3 o'clock in the morning through the Senate. So I would be...
After a series of hearings leading up to it.
Over 2 or 3 days, yeah, 750
well,
pages.
in commissions prior to that, but it was passed in short order. Is that a problem that the General Assembly consistently does this? You're supposed to have separate reading days?
The Safety Act involves different provisions, including one provision that I presided over 25 meetings over a 5-6 month period of time with regards to
decertification of police.
Exactly. That was not overnight. That wasn't last minute. Those were meetings that took place with state's attorneys at the table, with chiefs of police at the table, with sheriffs at the table. In fact, the Illinois Chiefs Police Association gave me their Public Servant of the Year award because of my work on the Safety Act.
What does that do? Briefly explain for those who aren't aware. Why do you believe that those changes are okay? And further, you talked more previously about full-out licensing of police. Does this go far enough?
Licensing is nomenclature, right? So certification, as it existed prior to the Safety Act, only allowed for decertification of an officer if they were convicted of a felony and certain misdemeanors. We expanded that to be consistent with a lot of states that have more robust opportunity to
get the bad apple police out of the system.
Because the bad apples make it bad for the vast majority of police officers who do their job the right way.
Now, to that end, the city of Chicago is under at least the police department is under a federal consent decree due to mandated changes to the CPD's policies. Now, the Attorney General, responsible for reviewing those reforms and enforcing any potential violations. There is a report that has found compliance with so far only 380 of 523 consent decree paragraphs. So, Mr. Raul, your office has extended the deadline. How are you working with the Chicago Police Department to ensure that goals are met and on time?
We're working in a multifaceted way. You know, we work to hold them accountable, but we try to work collaboratively as well. I understand that during these years we've had a pandemic. The Chicago Police Department has had a change in leadership 3 or 4 times, and so I understand those obstacles. And at the same time, we're not in a rush to just check boxes. We want to make sure that these provisions of the consent decree are done in a comprehensive way, such that we can change policing to be one of constitutional policing. Unfortunately, Judge Dow, who was presiding over the process,
now moving on, going to Washington, D.C. Now, Mr. DeVore, if you were elected, would you enforce that CPD consent decree?
Absolutely. I mean, that consent decree was put in place about 4 years ago, and most of those decrees that have been issued across the nation, they're 5 to 10 years before there's full compliance. So that decree is in place. The Attorney General has been working with CPD on that, and that's not a bad thing. But it's the issue of the certification that you were talking about. That was a completely separate bill that the Attorney General was working on with law enforcement. And then in the wee hours of the night, a few days before the new General Assembly took over in January of 2021, that bill got shoved in and isolated together with what is now the Safety Act. So, you know, there was some.
This is where you're saying an element of the unconstitutionality because it blends too many piecemeal aspects of law into one when it's supposed to be single issue. Mr. R will counter that. That happens a lot in Springfield. Is it wrong?
Does. No, it's not. As long as there's a nexus under single subject, as it's been evaluated historically, allows broad discretion to the legislature. And this is the police certification has to do with criminal justice, as does bail.
Briefly, to be clear, do you stand by the police certification process within the Safety Act? It's just a matter of how it got to that point?
You know, we could have that policy debate about whether it goes too far, et cetera, right? I mean, you can get kind of emotional sides of that. I can tell you that
Does it go too far?
In some aspects, yeah. I mean, the FOP, what they were really frustrated with is, you know, they were getting really close to that agreement, trying to play a part in that conversation, and then the Attorney General cut them off. So I know they were getting really close with the terms on that. I don't think they were quite there, but you know, the way that it was abruptly stopped and then consolidated with the Safety Act is really what frustrated the state FOP.
I want to move on to, but just briefly, is that how it went down?
No. We had, in fact, in my conversations, in my direct conversations with the state FOP, they thanked me for engaging them.
Chris Southwood would probably disagree with him.
That's an FOP leader.
He's the president of the FOP.
Now, in terms of gun-related crime, first I would like to establish, do you have a concealed carry license?
No, I don't.
Do you?
Yes.
Do you carry a gun?
Not usually, no.
Okay. And when do you?
To be honest with you, I don't think I have since I got it, to be honest with you.
Just for safekeeping, just in case?
Yeah.
All right. On to, in terms of gun-related crime, Mr. DeVore, what needs to change in the Attorney General's office handling of those issues?
You know, gun-related crimes are crimes that involve weapons, so it's talking about crime in its totality. You know, when we talk about being tough on crime, there's another component of that, which is dealing with the underlying issues of what's causing the crime in the first place. When I go into the communities that are having high rates of crime, that's an important component that they don't feel is getting enough attention. So, you know, we can be as hard on crime as we need to be, but if we don't couple that with coming up with real, and again, this is not so much for the Attorney General to
You're talking
handle.
About what? More money for communities?
Socioeconomic issues, right? There's nothing for these young people to do, and they're getting in trouble. So while it's not a direct part of the Attorney General's role, using that office to help
What would you do?
I would help facilitate those conversations with other members of the legislature to start working on how we can put investments in these communities to start addressing crime. Because again, being tough on it and making sure those who commit crimes is something we have to do, but we can't just keep doing that and then bringing more new young people through the system of criminal justice. We have to figure out how to slow those and eliminate that.
Certainly legislative leaders and the governor talk a lot about making those investments that you've talked about. So Attorney General Raul, do you believe that your office needs more resources to combat gun crime?
Absolutely. First of all, I believe my office needs more resources, generally speaking. And
we agree on that, sir.
And you know, if you look at it from the standpoint in 2018, the year before I took office, the National Association of Attorneys General did a survey, and we were last in the country in terms of attrition. We've changed that. I've gone aggressively to the legislature, and I have to say that for every dollar spent on the Attorney General's office, based on fiscal year 22 stats, we return $39 to the General Revenue Fund. I have nothing in my portfolio that has that type of return on investment. With regards to gun crime, I agree with Mr. DeVore that there needs to be investment in community. We've done so in a limited fashion from the Attorney General's office. We supported programs like Ready Chicago that goes towards intervening with an at-risk
at-risk
population. But we have also directly confronted the fact that there's industries that depend upon trafficking guns to illegal gun owners. And that's why we created a crime gun tracing platform. That's why we sued. We actually sued the ATF because they had relicensed a rogue gun manufacturer that manufactures a gun that's illegal to own in the state of Illinois, that's often used in carjackings and the like. That's why we went to the General Assembly with the state police asking for authority to prosecute gun crimes on state roadways. And that's why we worked with Secret Service to prevent acts of targeted violence.
So some of the actions that are going on regarding combating gun crime, something that is, of course, unfortunately an issue we know all too well in Chicago. Now, Mr. DeVore, you have been very critical of the Cook County State's Attorney Kim Foxx. Let's take a listen to your comments at the Illinois State Fair this summer.
You make me Attorney General, and if Kim Foxx won't prosecute him, I will. And she better get the prosecuting, or we'll figure out a way to prosecute her.
Part in two bits. First, what do you mean by figure out a way to prosecute the Cook County State's Attorney? Under what authority might you do that, and how is that not a threat?
Well, it's not a threat. It's a conversation. I've answered this question many times. It's a conversation that needs to happen. If, in fact, we have public officials at any level, including state's attorneys, who are not doing their job and they're actually engaging in conduct which is not within their authority under the law, it could rise to the level of official misconduct. That's the conversation to have.
What do you mean by that?
Well, one of the things that she's done recently is just arbitrarily decided across the board that unless you have committed theft in excess of $1,000, she's not going to charge for felony theft. She doesn't have any authority to do that.
Isn't that prosecutorial discretion?
I would disagree. Prosecutorial discretion is very fact-specific, case-by-case determination. But when you're just across the board creating blanket policies like that that violate statute, that goes beyond prosecutorial discretion, in my opinion. And again, I'm merely suggesting that's a conversation that has to be had.
To you, do you believe that that is prosecutorial discretion? Can Kim Foxx change that threshold? It is Illinois law. $1,000 for shoplifting is felony.
Sure. Prosecutors exercise discretion all the time. Sometimes, whether it's federal prosecutors, we actually take cases that are brought to us by federal investigators that don't meet a threshold for federal prosecutors. So they exercise discretion. Local prosecutors exercise discretion. It's an exercise of discretion.
So you believe it is appropriate for the state's attorney of Cook County to have lowered that?
It's whether I agree with it or not. No, I don't agree on a blanket exercise of discretion, but I do believe it's within her prosecutorial discretion. And with the notion of suggesting that you're going to prosecute a prosecutor for the exercise of their discretion, I think that's outrageous.
To be clear here, I want to be sure, should Illinois consider lowering the threshold for, you've been involved, of course, with organized retail theft. Should Illinois, across the board, do what Cook County has done in terms of lowering the threshold from $1,000 for felony
They should have the discussion. They should have the discussion based on the fact that the threshold was set at a point of time where, if you looked at the dollar value at that time, it has changed over time. And so that discussion should take place. What I focused on with regards to retail crime is organized retail crime, because we've seen the smash and grabs that have taken place all over the country. We've seen stolen items being on their way to retail establishments, being stolen and being resold on online marketplaces and monetized to fund terrorism, gun trafficking, human trafficking. That's why I created a task force. That's why I lead a national working group, a bipartisan national working group, to work on that problem.
Mr. DeVore, your comments earlier, again, it wasn't just directed at Kim Foxx. You largely said, we're going to begin doing this if others don't. How would you do so?
We're going to do what? Prosecuting, maybe?
Correct.
Well, there's concurrent jurisdiction that the Attorney General has with every state's attorney in the state. It's common law that goes back forever. So the Attorney General, again, to the extent that office has concurrent jurisdiction, can, if he or she deems necessary, step into a county and prosecute cases that the state's attorney won't prosecute.
What that common law says is that we have to have the consent of that state's attorney. So
that's not exactly what it says.
He only partially mentions what the case says. The common law actually says that the Attorney General cannot act alone without the acquiescence of the state's attorney.
Well, acquiescence is not consent. What the Attorney General is referring to is there may be the opportunity for a state's attorney to try to object and to intervene with that concurrent jurisdiction. But to the extent that they want to just interject themselves and then just walk away from the prosecution, the Illinois Supreme Court is going to have to further address that. But
it's not something that's been tried.
Yeah, I have the case law right here. So
the concurrent jurisdiction has been tried. Yes.
Okay. I would like to move on to Mr. Raoul. You have as your top...
Just to be clear, it says where the state's attorney made no objection.
Where the but you're saying that the state's attorney could make an objection that would bring about a new court case.
Well, if the state's attorney makes an objection to the concurrent
I would imagine, let's say in
jurisdiction,
this scenario, that Kim Foxx would.
But to the extent she wants to object because she wants to prosecute, that's a different factual conversation than she wants to object merely to walk away from the case and leave it unprosecuted. That particular fact pattern, if necessary, because Kim Foxx wanted to be, act that way, we'll go to the Illinois Supreme Court and we'll find out. But the Attorney General's office, first and foremost, has to get to that step of saying, if you're going to blanketly not prosecute these cases, our office will, and then we can start that conversation.
The case law says the Attorney General lacks the authority to initiate action under the statutes here involved to the exclusion of the state's attorney. It can't be any more clear than that.
There we go. I am not a lawyer. You two are.
That's why it's the common law. He knows I'm right. That's okay.
Now, Attorney General Raoul, your top campaign contributor is nearly double that of your second, which is the Democratic Party of Illinois, also funded by Governor J.B. Pritzker. So if Pritzker is the top funder of your campaign with millions of dollars, don't you have an allegiance to him? Can you provide an instance where you have defied the governor's office? Or broken against?
I don't seek to try to defy the governor's office. In fact, I'm statutorily responsible to represent the governor's office. What I can tell you, as you know, I've served in elected office for now 18 years. I've never received a campaign contribution that's dictated what I do in my official duty, and that doesn't mean that's not going to stop now.
Go ahead.
The Attorney General recently has admitted on 2 occasions that it was a fair question as to whether or not the governor had the authority for the last 2.5 years to issue numerous of these mandates.
Talking about the executive orders regarding to COVID-19.
Yeah, just whether he had the authority. Fair question. Attorney General and I agree. To that extent, if it's a fair question of whether or not the governor is exercising executive power against 12.5 million people in the state, the Attorney General should always take the side of the people on a fair question and not take the side of the governor against the people. That's where Mr. Raoul and I fundamentally disagree, is that I would have taken the people's side, arguing that it was a fair question, that the governor doesn't have the power, and then the governor could have defended himself with his resources through the executive office. We left our people hanging out to dry for 2.5 years on that fair question.
Left the people hanging out to dry. Go ahead.
We saved people's lives. The exercise of the governor's authority, the data demonstrates saved lives. My wife is an anesthesiologist. The hospitalization rate per capita, the death rate per capita beats those of surrounding states that took a different approach.
I have to say this, with all due respect to the Attorney General, his role as the chief legal officer is not about measuring the medical data. The Attorney General's role is to measure the constitutionality and the law that's being wielded by the executive.
So what should have happened during COVID?
And courts have spoken over and over because of his excessive filing of cases.
And I ultimately ended up, the only case that the governor ever won is that he could issue serial proclamations. It wasn't even a case I was in. Serial proclamations now 34 months in. The governor has never won a case to the extent of him wielding this power. He's never wielded. So what I would have done when the governor...
Yes, how would you have kept people safe? Again, part of the state's role, you would be a constitutional officer in this scenario.
Keeping the people safe from executive abuse is what the Attorney General should do. It was real simple. When the governor started wielding that executive power, the Attorney General, knowing that it was a fair question, should have demanded that the legislature step in and pass policy and legislation. identical to what the governor did. That would have been fine. But we allowed a governor to wield unprecedented power for 3 years. The Attorney General could have stepped up and said, no, I'm going to bring an action testing this, and the legislature could have fixed it.
He just acknowledged that the court said that the governor had the authority to do so. He just said it a few seconds ago.
He had the authority to issue a disaster proclamation.
And that's what was being litigated.
That doesn't know what was being litigated. Sorry, you weren't there, sir. I was there for thousands of hours. What was there is, regardless of a disaster proclamation, could the governor wield executive power, closing businesses and putting masks on kids and all of those things? The governor never won any of those cases.
This may not have been a formal debate, but certainly a debate.
Because it's moot, because he dropped his executive orders.
I would like to just ask a simple question here. Illinois, of course, has a body that is in charge of discipline of attorneys. Have either of you had, or to your knowledge, been investigated by the ARDC? Mr. Raoul.
I had a case filed against me, actually, when I was an assistant state's attorney years ago. It was unfounded.
Unfounded. And you, Mr. DeVore, anything founded or any investigations?
No, nothing founded. Of course, over my 12-year career, like the Attorney General, there's been complaints. Every lawyer deals with that, but nothing's ever been founded.
And we are running shortly out of time here, so I would like to just briefly get each of you one sentence. There are historic lows about the approval by the public of the Supreme Court of the United States, particularly after the Dobbs decision. Where do you stand in terms of legitimacy of the Supreme Court?
I share the concerns of the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court that the conflicts of interest that have been raised about members of the court is concerning.
And Mr. DeVore?
The Attorney General wants to talk about conflicts of interest. I think we've addressed that on his role. But any time that our Supreme Court makes decisions one way or another that are politically sensitive, this always happens. Whether it's a Democratic Supreme Court or a Republican Supreme Court, it goes with the territory. So.
Well, we will see which of you gets the territory of the Attorney General's office come November 8th. Our deep appreciation to both of you for being here. That is Attorney General candidates Democrat Kwame Raoul and Republican Thomas DeVore.
Good job, sir.
Also on the ballot is Libertarian candidate Daniel Robin. You can find out more about him on our WTTW online voter guide, where you'll also find a rundown of other local races and candidates in their own words on why they want your vote. That's all at WTTW.com/voter guide. May not have been caught by the cameras, but these two gentlemen did shake hands. There's more Chicago Tonight just ahead, so stick around.
Still to come on Chicago Tonight, Adidas drops its deal with a prominent musician following anti-Semitic comments. This as city data shows hate crimes are on the rise in Chicago. A look at how students with disabilities have been impacted by the pandemic in light of historic learning setbacks nationwide. And artistic views of elements of the Greek landscape. We talk with the photographer, a Greek prince visiting Chicago. But first, some more of today's top stories. Improvements are underway at the Juvenile Temporary Detention Center. Chief Judge Tim Evans says after a long process, the changes include disciplinary confinement in the youth's room will now be limited to 30 minutes, followed by 30 minutes during which the youth will work with a counselor to complete a rational self-analysis of their behavior. The earliest bedtime is now at 8 p.m., this after concerns regarding the total amount of time youth spent in their rooms. And mental health staff are partnering with consultants to create culturally relevant, trauma-informed evening programming. Former attorney Joel Brodsky, who seized the national spotlight by representing convicted wife killer Drew Peterson, is running to represent Lakeview on Chicago's City Council. Brodsky represented Peterson, a former Bolingbrook police sergeant, when he was convicted in 2012 of killing his third wife, Kathleen Savio. Brodsky has since been stripped of his license to practice law and has been working as a consultant and investigator. Current alderperson Tom Tunney is not seeking a sixth term and has endorsed his chief of staff, Bennett Lawson, in that race. You can find the full story on our website. Urban Prep Academy leaders are speaking up against Chicago Public Schools' plan to take over the charter schools' Inglewood and Bronzeville campuses. This amid claims of financial mismanagement and a sexual misconduct investigation of the school's founder.
After having not 30% of our graduates have the high school requirements to attend college, but 100% of our graduates for 13 years, over 2,200 urban prep graduates have been accepted to a four-year college and university. But we have to stand here demanding, pleading that this institution, that is an organization run by black educators, is not eliminated or taken over by CPS.
The district is recommending that its school board revoke the charter school licenses during Wednesday's Board of Education meeting. Urban prep leaders are calling on Mayor Lori Lightfoot to intervene. Adidas says it's ending its $1 million partnership with musician and fashion designer Ye following recent anti-Semitic comments. He's the rapper formerly known as Kanye West, and he's come under fire for a series of remarks against the Jewish community. The move comes as Chicago's Commission on Human Relations says hate crimes are up in the city, the most frequent targets being Jewish and black residents. So joining us now with more is David Goldenberg, Midwest Regional Director of the Anti-Defamation League. David, welcome back. Thanks for joining us. So the Chicago Commission on Human Relations has reported that 77 crimes were reported to the commission, I think up to this point this year. 120 were reported to the CPD. Now that's 77 crimes reported to the commission. That's a 71% increase. What do you think is causing this increase?
We know that these numbers are up, and in fact, it is just a continuation, frankly, of what we've seen over the last 4 or 5 years. Look, ADL's been tracking anti-Semitic incidents since 1979, and last year was the highest number of anti-Semitic incidents we have tracked nationwide, and also here in Illinois and in the Midwest in our entire history. Just to put things in perspective, too, is it's not just the year-over-year increases, but the trends are quite concerning, because when you go between 2016 and 2021, ADL tracked a 430% increase in anti-Semitic incidents here in Illinois. So these numbers that we're seeing here out of the city are very much in line with, unfortunately, what we've seen in the last few years.
And to your point, the commission also says that of those targets that that had been reported, 18 were against Jewish people, 16 against black people, 12 against white, and it goes on to break it even further down, 9 against LGBTQ, as well as people who are biracial, Arab, and Catholic. You've mentioned, that 40%, David, of hate crimes go unreported. What are some of the reasons for that?
We know these numbers are underreported for a number of reasons. First and foremost, there's a lack of trust between many marginalized and targeted communities and law enforcement. Individuals who are victims don't feel safe going to police. Additionally, we know there's concern by victims that they could be targeted again, and also that there could be a stigma within their own communities that they're ultimately targeted. So for us, there's an issue of reporting from the victim and being able to then support the victim of these hate crimes. And there's also an issue of law enforcement not necessarily doing an adequate job of tracking and reporting this data as well.
What can be done? What is being done to improve hate crime reporting?
There's a number of things, and I'm proud to serve on Governor Pritzker's Commission on Discrimination and Hate Crimes, which was reconstituted about 1.5 years ago. And earlier this year, we published our recommendations. And among those recommendations were creating a statewide hotline through which people can report if they are a victim of a hate crime or a hate incident. So therefore, if they have concerns to go to law enforcement, it's a non-law enforcement mechanism through which they can report. Another recommendation of the commission is to allow NGOs, whether it be groups like Equality Illinois or the Chinese American Service League or Asian Americans Advancing Justice or ADL, to be able to serve as an intake for these types of hate incidents as well. So individual communities might trust others to come to them. And then lastly, how do we create better training for law enforcement? Right now, it's not a mandate that law enforcement receive hate crimes training and prosecutors receive hate crimes training. So there's some significant opportunities for us to go down this road. And actually, Attorney General Raoul in his office just secured a near $400,000 grant to provide hate crimes training to prosecutors and law enforcement around the state.
Meanwhile, this also comes as CPD has decided not to fire the officer who is found to be affiliated with the Proud Boys. What is your reaction to that?
We know that this particular incident really is just one example of a really big problem, and that is extremists who are infiltrating law enforcement. Just in the last few weeks, ADL released a groundbreaking report where we identified across the country literally thousands of individuals who are members of the military, members of law enforcement, elected officials, or first responders who showed up on a membership list of the white supremacist group, the Oath Keepers. And you may remember the Oath Keepers and the Proud Boys were two of the main groups who were responsible for the January 6th insurrection of the US Capitol. Here in Illinois, we tracked and identified 36 individuals, just part of the Oath Keepers, who are here in Illinois, who are either currently or previously working for law enforcement, the military, were elected officials or first responders. And this included 21 members of law enforcement. So we know that while this is one particular individual in the city of Chicago, and we believe that police departments and municipalities have to take the necessary action to root out extremists from law enforcement, we also know that it is a much larger problem in the state and in the country.
And speaking of across the country, this weekend, an anti-Semitic hate group hung a banner on an LA freeway that read, quote, "Kanye is right about the Jews." Adidas has ended up cutting ties with the Chicago rapper just today. Should more big companies be taking this approach, not just when a celebrity is involved, though?
I think it's important for companies to put people over profits. And it goes whether it be for social media companies that continue to allow misinformation and hateful ideologies to manifest themselves on those platforms, or whether it be celebrities who speak out with such vitriol and hate and toward individuals or toward groups. And so in this particular case, these companies were very happy, made a decision to choose people over profits. But what's also really important is that these individuals have platforms, and how they use these platforms to spread hateful messages and lies are really important, and we can't dismiss that, because this was an individual, made these anti-Semitic comments that were disgusting and downright dangerous, and we saw across the board members of extremist groups who were embracing his anti-Semitism, embracing his purchase of Parler. And ultimately, what we saw in California, we saw white supremacist groups that dropped banners. We've seen the language online. And what we've seen ultimately are individuals who are inspired by these ideologies and unfortunately take action. And this was all occurring also. Keep in mind that this Thursday is the anniversary of the attack of the Tree of Life in Pittsburgh.
David, we've got about 20 seconds left. Do you foresee these hate groups and anti-Semitic groups continuing to be a threat? Is this rise going to continue?
We have to stop the normalization of hate. And that requires us to speak out. It requires us to share facts and respond to misinformation. And it requires us to all show strength together so that when this type of anti-Semitism, when this type of hate shows its ugly face, we collectively as a community shove it back into underneath the rock from which it came.
We'll have to leave it there. David Goldenberg from the Anti-Defamation League, thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
During the pandemic, students with disabilities faced unique challenges, especially during periods of remote learning. And just yesterday, the National Assessment of Educational Progress, also known as the nation's report card, found that the pandemic erased decades of academic progress. Joining us now with more on the pandemic's impact on students is Jane Vaughn, a freelancer with Chalk Beat Chicago. We also invited a representative from Chicago Public Schools to join us for this conversation, but they declined. Jane Vaughn, thank you for joining us. So what were some of the ways that you found that students with disabilities, as well as their families, struggled in particular during remote learning?
There were a lot of ways, and I know that all students struggled with remote learning during COVID, but these issues were really especially exacerbated for these students with disabilities. And they just really struggled. Some of them who were supposed to get speech therapy, they just didn't talk a lot during the remote learning. They regressed in their potty training. Some of them started wetting the bed. They had other regressionary behaviors, impulsivity problems. One of them set a fire. They started taking things apart, kind of destructive behaviors. So they really struggled with the isolation. One of them developed anxiety and depression. She started hyperventilating. So there were really a lot of different issues that these kids had. And then for their parents, they had to watch their kids really struggle. A lot of them said they felt like a bad mom, felt like a bad parent, that they couldn't get their kid the services they needed, or they took a financial hit of having to pay for private services. If they felt the school was not providing the services their kid needs, they would just pay for a private therapist, which has a big financial impact.
And Jane, give us a sense of what are some of the disabilities and needs that some of the students are dealing with.
Yeah, so for the kids that I talked with, they had a bunch of different things. ADHD and autism were pretty common. Some of them had a sensory processing disorder, anxiety, depression, dyslexia, speech and developmental delays were also pretty common. So in terms of an IEP, these kids were entitled to different services, speech therapy, occupational therapy, social work. Some of them had an in-classroom aid or specialized instruction, and then a lot of them got transportation or busing services as well.
So just yesterday, we learned of these historic setbacks for students nationwide. What should we take away from those reports when we think about students with disabilities?
Sure. I mean, I think the main thing is that people tend to think because we're back to in-person school now that everything is fine. And that's really not the case, for gen ed kids, or especially for kids with disabilities. Some of them are 2+ years behind in the skills compared to where they would have been if the pandemic had not happened. And that's both more academic skills like letter sounds and, like I said, more, personal skills like potty training or social emotional skills with the isolation. So just because we're back in person doesn't mean that everything is fine. These kids have not been meeting some of their goals. And so how do you catch up or make up for 2+ years of that lost learning?
And we should point out, students with disabilities, students who are in special education, typically have something called an IEP, an individualized education plan, which is a legal document prescribing the services and treatments that students are required to have to support their learning. Jane, you also wrote about how CPS implemented its own recovery services program. Explain for us what that is, please.
Sure. So I should say this information I gathered was collected towards the end of the summer, so it might have been updated. But it's basically CPS's plan of trying to identify where kids regressed and then catch them back up to where they would have been. So what you have to do is provide data showing that a student regressed in a particular skill during remote learning. So it's not enough to have not improved. You have to actually regress in a certain skill. The problems that I've heard about with this standard is, number one, that it's hard to get data to prove that the kid regressed because it was harder to collect data over the pandemic and assess students virtually. So if you don't have the data, it's hard to prove regression. And number two, people had a problem with the standard of no regression that only puts a kid at where they would have been in March of 2020. They're not moving forward or learning, they're just not backsliding. So in a best case scenario, they're where they would have been, March of 2020, even though we're 2+ years later. And then there's also not been a lot of interest really in the program, I guess I would say. There's 50,000 students in CPS with IEPs, and this is according to data Chalkbeat got through a Freedom of Information request. But only 281 students out of 50,000 requested recovery services. So not a lot of students in CPS are even engaging with the recovery services program.
So just a fraction, it sounds like. Special education is typically the toughest to staff in most school districts. What did you learn about how that impacted student learning?
Yeah, for sure. And again, it's not just a CPS problem, but the shortage of special ed teachers was really dramatic. Again, Chalkbeat has data that there are more than 10,000 special education positions budgeted, but as of the first day of school this year, more than 700 of those had yet to be filled. So there's a huge shortage of those special ed staff, which then means there aren't people available to help these kids catch back up. They're 2 years behind, and there's not enough people to help them even try to make those efforts. There's also shortages of district reps, which are basically in charge of making sure IEPs are evaluated and on time and sort of taking care of the schools and their IEPs. And there aren't enough people doing that. There's shortages there. And then we've all heard about the shortages of bus drivers, which means the kids can't get the transportation services they might be entitled to.
Okay, a lot of work to be done there. Jane Vaughn, thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you.
Up next, artistic views of the natural world by a Greek prince with a family connection to the English monarchy. Stay with us. Do you think there's been sort of a rethinking of how those events happened here in Chicago?
I made a promise to myself in my career that every year I would make a piece of art dedicated to the memory.
Got into a zone of mentor to children. See what we can do to kind of elevate each other. We all we got at this point.
I'm using my past to push forward, to build a movement to create the world that we all want to see.
One of the last museums to open following the shutdown is the Hellenic Museum in Greektown, and their first show has a royal pedigree. A featured photographer and artist who's also a Greek prince. He visited Chicago for the first time, and producer Mark Vitale recently met him to talk mainly about his artwork, but also about his family ties to the British monarchy.
The sounds of nature on a Greek summer night accompany a large-scale photograph of 2 olive trees on the island of Milos.
I want people to come in, get fully immersed and contemplate. I want them to forget about everything that's bothering them in their lives or even making them happy. I just want them to leave the outside world behind and come inside.
At Chicago's Hellenic Museum, an exhibition called Resilience considers the natural world through a series of vivid abstractions. It was the pandemic project of Prince Nikolaos, son of the last king and queen of Greece.
The majority of this work was created during that first lockdown in the pandemic. And so Resilience was born out of that because, first of all, the Greek people throughout the ages have been extremely resilient, be it from occupation to wars, famines, civil strife, most recently financial crisis, and lately the pandemic. But the pandemic affected the entire world. I'm just looking at it through my countrymen's eyes, the Greek's eyes, because that's where I live and that's where my nation is.
The almost psychedelic effect of some of these abstract photographs, including this view of the Acropolis, is due to the prince's unusual process.
I had already photographed certain images, and I then printed those on aluminum, and then I immersed those in a body of water, and then I took a photograph from outside of the water to get the effect. And the effect is the refraction of the colors from the bottom to the surface of the water. The exhibition is based on a quote by a famous Greek Nobel laureate poet called Odysseus Elitis. He said, if you deconstruct Greece, you'll be left with a vine, an olive tree, and a boat. Therefore, with these 3 things, you can reconstruct Greece. So I took that quote and I've loosely aligned my exhibit towards that. So there's a water element, there's a grape and wine element, there's an olive oil and olive tree element.
One image is a photograph he took of the bottom of the sea. It's actually a mosaic printed on 272 pieces of recycled plastic. The prince's wife offered advice when his early efforts to capture the natural world proved frustrating.
She said, don't try and capture what your eye sees. Try and capture what your soul is feeling when you see that with your eyes. And that changed everything.
Prince Nikolaos is also the godson and cousin of the new King Charles III of England. We offered our condolences on the death of his aunt, Queen Elizabeth.
She's been a tremendous person in the history of the country and in the history of the world, because she's witnessed and been part of so many historical events. So she will be sorely missed. I believe she'd want people to look to the future, and in that future you'll have King Charles right now, who I think will do a tremendous job. He's a very sensitive individual and another person who's also selflessly given himself to the duty of the country, and I think he'll do a marvelous job.
We turned our attention back to the prince's artwork at this, his first North American exhibition. Incredibly, he does not enhance the color on his photographs.
Everything you see is what I saw, everything you see is what my camera saw, and what you see is what you get. You can recreate some of these colors, but the beauty is nature can provide them. If you're in the right place at the right time and you're patient enough, she will deliver. That's why I say nature is the artist, I'm just the messenger.
For Chicago Tonight, this is Mark Vitale.
And this story first aired last month, just days after the death of Queen Elizabeth II. And the National Hellenic Museum of Chicago is now open. You can see more of Prince Nicolaus's photography there until December 30th, and also on our website, where we share his full comments on the late Queen Elizabeth and his godfather, King Charles. We're back to wrap things up right after this.
Chicago Tonight is made possible in part by Alexandra and John Nichols, the Jim and Kay Mabey family, the Polk Brothers Foundation, and the support of these donors.
And that's our show for this Tuesday night. Don't forget to stay connected with us by signing up for our daily briefing. And you can get Chicago Tonight streamed on Facebook, YouTube, and our website, WTTW.com/news. You can also get the show via podcast and the PBS video app. And please join us tomorrow night live at 7. Candidates vying for the Secretary of State seat, that's open for the first time in decades. They face off in our WTTW News Forum. Plus, 50 years into Title IX, trans athletes seek protection to participate in women's sports. Now, for all of us here at Chicago Tonight, I'm Brandis Friedman. Thanks for watching. Stay healthy and safe, and have a good night.
Closed captioning is made possible by Robert A. Clifford and Clifford Law Offices, a Chicago personal injury and wrongful death firm that supports free educational initiatives in the legal profession.